So let's look at some of these terms. I can do it. Which might be something. Is that true? I can't seem to get it better than that. Oh, I just wanted to talk about a sort of transition. I mean, bear in mind, I'm talking about both and either or, if you feel what I mean. But on the left is a column of terms which, in my opinion, define the old culture, which we're leaving behind. And on the right, a set of terms that help to define the emergent culture. But of course, we're in a period of enormous transition, and we always will be. There's never a point when we're not in a period of transition. And there was no past, and there is no future. But it may be useful to look at these sorts of ways of trying to pin down where psychologically we have found ourselves, and where we do find ourselves now. For example, art was largely understood in the West for many centuries as something which involved, from the point of the viewer, an act of reception. The viewer was someone who received from the artwork an experience, a set of ideas, a set of feelings, an ideology. But now, with interactive systems that underwrite the art that we've become involved in, the viewer is involved in an act of negotiation. A negotiation to create an experience. A negotiation to create a meaning. Even a negotiation to create more images. Secondly, art, Western art, has been very much concerned with representation. Usually within an ideological frame that was very clearly apparent. Whereas my feeling is that we're moving into, and with that, by the way, a great deal of analysis was involved. In fact, there have been periods, certainly in the academic world, when the analytical function of those involved in representation came to outweigh even the act of expression itself. Whereas I believe now we're much more concerned with building, with making, or rather with allowing to emerge out of interactions of minds, out of interactions of people in the net. Allowing forms and ideas to emerge out of the interaction, which is an act of construction rather than representation. Again, the past, if you look at art over the last year, it was absolutely obsessed with hermeneutics. That is, means there is like a meaning back of it all, and our job is to find out what it is. And this extended to the world. The world was seen as like a big book, and it was difficult to read it, but you could get to read it, and there would, if you could get to read it, you would know what the meaning of the world was. And there were many claims for that, often from religious organizations, but as well from academic organizations, even from political organizations. Each one who said, look, I can do this hermeneutic analysis. Hermeneutic simply means, the secret that is embedded, hermetically hidden in whatever is the case, and pulling it out, teasing it out. There was thought to be meaning in the world. My world is one where there's no meaning, and we move through it. We do stuff in it. We create meaning. We actually create a reality as a heuristic behavior. Again, tunnel vision seemed to be embedded even in the form of art. Remember the picture frame. It was like a picture window on reality. You couldn't change the reality couldn't touch you. It was fixed, and it was the product of a focus. You could actually never look back. In fact, those of you who ever bothered to look at the history of Renaissance art will recall how the space was so constructed that there was one position, ultimately, from which you should observe it, in order for all things to fall into place in the simulation of a kind of Euclidean space that was behind the laws of perspective. But now we're involved with a kind of bird's eye view. I don't mean simply as a consequence of of cubism and futurism, of flying over events, of seeing all the angles, but I mean of actually penetrating into things, of seeing things at different levels, different scales. That's how we view the world. We've got no time for the picture frame window on the world. We want a doorway that we can move into and move around through the world in terms of examining it. Again, the Western artist was always concerned, was praised for the content that she or he brought to the work, the meaning, the content, the ideas, the genius that produced them. Art was about content. Art now is about context. The artist now is a person who can create the context in which she or he and others can interact to generate meanings, to generate images, to generate experiences. Art shifts from being the business of creating content to creating context. Again, we're obsessed with the object. The materialism of our world is about objects and owning objects, pointing to objects, measuring the world in terms of objects. But those of us involved with interactive art, and we know that scientists too who are at work in the world today, are more concerned to look at the world in terms of process. Cybernetics, which underlies that term cyberspace, which has received a lot of abuse over quite a few years now. Cybernetics is about understanding the world in terms of how one thing affects another thing, how everything is in, a little bit like those molecules. Those of you who saw the program on nanotechnology last night realize that when you get down about as far as we can go anyway, everything's moving. Everything's like moving, and you've got to freeze it down to what we would call unreal temperatures to get it to be apparently, or so apparently, static. It'll never be static. Everything is in flux. Everything's affecting everything else. In fact, if you want to define the things, you've got to define the relationships which are constantly changing between the things, if you want to get some sort of a take on reality in that way. And this is seeing the world in terms of process, which is what our art is about. Again, perspective was a way of separating out the viewer from the art. Just as religion, with all its priests and all its ceremonies, was a great way of separating out the punter from the god. You know, keep them apart. Keep the scientist away from them. Don't let the scientist get his hands on things. Don't let him interact with the experiment. Till quantum physics came along and said, hey, wait a minute, all there is like a field of consciousness. And it's only through interacting with these particles that they do anything anyway. So let's start a physics which is about interacting with the particles, rather than about standing, as Wheeler, one of the great quantum physicists, said, behind a plate glass window and trying to observe it. Let's smash the window and get into it. And this immersion is not just a feature of cyberspace and virtual reality, but it is a way that we want to deal with. We want to immerse ourselves within the process rather than standing back, coldly trying to measure it, calculate it at a distance.